Grace Bennett's hands did not shake as she folded the last shirt into the suitcase, and that steadiness frightened her more than anything else in the house had in 3 months. She zipped the bag closed on the bed she had slept in every night since taking the job, in a room down the hall from a man who had just put his fist through a mahogany table hard enough to split the wood. The sound of it still lived in her ears. But it was not the broken table that had her packing. It was what he had said after, low and flat, the kind of voice that did not need to shout to make a room go cold. She had heard men raise their voices before. She had never heard one go quiet like that and mean it more. 3 months earlier, she had walked into this house with a single duffel bag and a nursing license that qualified her for exactly the kind of work no agency wanted to take twice. Private care for a man who had survived a car that no longer resembled a car, a spine injury that had taken the use of his legs, and a temper that the hospital staff had warned her about in hushed voices before she ever signed the contract. Matteo Russo did not want a nurse. He wanted, according to the man who hired her, someone who could handle him. She had assumed handle meant medication schedules and physical therapy compliance. She learned within the first week that it meant something closer to survival. The house sat behind iron gates in a part of the city where the houses did not have addresses so much as reputations. Staten Island, old money built on things nobody discussed at dinner. Grace had grown up an hour and a world away from that kind of wealth, the daughter of a mechanic and a woman who cleaned other people's houses, and she had learned early that money like this did not explain itself to people like her. She was not impressed by the chandelier in the foyer or the car collection under a tarp in the garage that nobody drove anymore. She noticed instead what it cost. The 2 men who stood by the gate at all hours, the way the housekeeper flinched when a door closed too hard, the way Matteo Russo had looked at her the first day, not with interest, but with the flat calculation of a man deciding whether she was a liability before she had said a single word. He had been sitting by the window when she walked in for the first time, wrapped in a wheelchair he treated like an insult, wearing a shirt that had clearly been tailored before the accident and now hung differently on a frame that had lost muscle it once had. His eyes were the color of wet slate, and his hands, still and folded in his lap, looked like they belonged to a man twice his stillness. He had not offered his name. He had said, "You're the 4th one they've sent." She had said, "I'm not planning on being the 5th one who leaves." He had not smiled. He had simply looked at her a beat longer than necessary and told the housekeeper to show her to her room. That had been the whole of their first conversation. It should have told her everything she needed to know, and in some ways it had. He did not waste words. He did not perform warmth he did not feel. When he was in pain, which was often in those early weeks, he did not ask for help. He endured it the way she imagined he had endured everything else in his life, alone and without witnesses, until she made it clear that she was going to be a witness whether he liked it or not. The job description had said personal care and medication management. It had not said anything about the men who came through the study at odd hours, speaking in tones too low for her to catch words, but not too low for her to catch the shape of tension in them. It had not mentioned the gun that lived in the drawer of his nightstand, which she found while reorganizing his medications, and never mentioned finding. It had not explained why the housekeeper crossed herself quietly every time a car pulled up the drive that she did not recognize. Grace had taken the job because the pay was extraordinary and her student loans were not. And she had told herself in the beginning that she only needed to manage his body. She had not accounted for how much of nursing was intimacy, how many hours she would spend with her hands on a man's skin, adjusting him, moving him, learning the topography of scars that told stories she was not allowed to ask about. The first time he said her name, 3 weeks in, it had landed differently than she expected. "Grace," he had said, not sharply, just once, testing the shape of it in his mouth like he was deciding whether it belonged in this house. She had felt it low in her chest and told herself it meant nothing. She had a job to do. He was a patient, complicated and dangerous in ways she did not fully understand yet, and she intended to keep her attention exactly where it belonged, on his blood pressure and his physical therapy compliance, and nothing else. But the house did not let people keep their attention where it belonged. Not this house. The second month brought the incident with the car in the driveway, a black sedan that pulled up at 2 in the morning with its headlights off, and the sound of Mateo's voice through the study door, telling someone that if they came near this house again, there would not be a conversation next time. Grace had stood at the top of the stairs in her robe, unable to move, and watched 2 of his men escort a stranger off the property, with a firmness that left no question about what would have happened had she not stayed at the top of those stairs. When Mateo wheeled himself past her afterward, his jaw tight, he had stopped just long enough to say, "Go back to bed, Grace. This isn't yours to carry." She had wanted to argue that she lived here now, that anything happening under this roof was hers to carry, whether he liked it or not. But something in his face had stopped her. Not anger, something closer to shame, quickly hidden. That was the night she started paying closer attention to who Matteo Russo actually was. She learned pieces of it the way anyone learns anything in a house full of secrets, by accident and inference. A framed photograph in a drawer she was not looking through so much as organizing. A younger Matteo standing beside an older man with the same slate eyes, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She learned the older man was his father, and that his father was dead, killed in a manner nobody in the house would describe to her directly. She learned there had been a brother once too, older, named Salvatore, whose photograph did not appear anywhere in the house at all, which told her more than any photograph could have. Matteo did not speak of him. The housekeeper, an older woman named Rosa, who had worked for the family for 30 years, only shook her head when Grace asked once, carefully, if there had been other family. "Some doors," Rosa said, "are better left shut, cara." Grace had not asked again. She learned, too, that the accident that had taken his legs had not been an accident at all, though the official story called it one. She learned this from the tightness in his shoulders whenever the topic of the crash came up in casual conversation with visitors, the way his hand would find the arm of his wheelchair and grip it like he was bracing against something no physical therapy could touch. She learned it fully one night in the 4th week, when a fever from an infection in his leg had loosened something in him that his usual control kept locked down. And in the haze of it, he had said a name she did not recognize, over and over, low and pained. Not Salvatore. A different name, a man's name, spoken with the particular grief reserved for someone who had died protecting you. She had sat beside his bed that whole night, changing the cool cloth on his forehead, and had not asked him about it once he was lucid again. He had thanked her the next morning with a stiffness that told her he remembered exactly what he had said, and hoped desperately that she had not understood any of it. She had understood enough. By the 5th week, something had shifted between them that neither of them named. He began waiting for her in the mornings instead of being wheeled to breakfast by Rosa. He began asking her opinion on things that had nothing to do with his medical care. What she thought of a business decision he would not fully explain. What she thought of a man who had come to the house asking for money he had no intention of repaying. She had told him plainly, "The man is lying to you. Watch his hands, not his mouth." Matteo had studied her for a long moment after that, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and said, "Most people around me only tell me what they think I want to hear." She had said, "I'm not most people." He had said, "No, you're not." It had not sounded like a compliment. It had sounded like a diagnosis he was still working out the implications of. The turning point, the one Grace would return to later when she tried to understand how she had ended up packing a suitcase in a house she had told herself meant nothing to her, came on an ordinary Tuesday in the 6th week. A man named Enzo Bellini, a rival from a family 2 boroughs over, had sent flowers to the house with a card that read something Grace was not shown, but that made Rosa go pale reading it over Matteo's shoulder. Matteo had gone still in the way he went still before something dangerous happened, and had told 2 of his men to find out everything about where Enzo Bellini had breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the next week. Grace, watching from the doorway, had understood without being told that this was not about flowers. This was a message, and the message had been received, and something was going to happen because of it. That night, unable to sleep, she had gone down to the kitchen for water and found Matteo alone in the study, staring at a chessboard he was not playing against anyone. She had asked, without meaning to sound as concerned as she did, if he was going to be all right. He had looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, something in his face had cracked open just slightly, just enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath the control. "I don't know how to be anything else," he had said. "This is what I inherited. It's what killed my father, and it's what will probably kill me." She had crossed the room without deciding to, and sat across from him, and had said, "That doesn't mean it has to be all you are." He had looked at her a long moment and said, "You say that like you believe it." She had said, "I do." He had said her name then, Grace, in that different way he said it, and something in the room had changed temperature entirely. She had left before anything happened. She had told herself it was professionalism. It was not entirely professionalism. The Bellini situation had escalated over the following 2 weeks in ways Grace only understood in fragments. Men coming and going at odd hours. Matteo on the phone in a tone she had never heard him use, controlled fury dressed up as calm negotiation. One night she had found blood on the sleeve of one of his men's jackets in the laundry and had said nothing, had simply done what she always did, which was manage what was in front of her and not ask questions that would not get honest answers. She understood by then that she had crossed some invisible threshold in this house, from outsider to something closer to trusted, and that trust came with the price of silence about things she would rather not have known. It was during this stretch that Enzo Bellini's people made a mistake that changed everything. A car had followed Grace on her one day off in 3 weeks, trailing her from the pharmacy to the grocery store to the small apartment she still technically rented across the city, sitting empty most nights now. She had noticed it the way anyone trained to notice things notices them, a persistence that was not coincidence. She had gone straight back to the mansion instead of home and had told Matteo exactly what she had seen, calmly, factually, the way she reported vital signs. He had gone very quiet. Then he had asked her to describe the car in detail, and when she had, his jaw had tightened in a way that told her the description meant something specific to him. "You're not leaving this house until this is resolved," he had said. It had not been a request. "I have a life outside this house, Matteo," she had said. "I have an apartment. I have a sister I promised to see this weekend." "Not until this is resolved," he had said again, and something in the flatness of his voice had made her angry in a way she had not expected. "You don't get to make that decision for me," she had said. "I do when it's my mess that put a car on your tail," he had said, and for the first time, real feeling had broken through the control in his voice, something that sounded almost like fear dressed up as authority. "If something happened to you because of me," he had started, and then stopped himself, jaw working, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. She had not pushed him to finish it. She had understood, in that unfinished sentence, more than she had understood in 6 weeks of careful observation. This was not just concern for a liability. This was something else, something he was fighting even as he said it. The week that followed was the tensest of her employment. Extra men at the gate, Matteo barely sleeping, spending nights in the study with the chessboard he still was not playing, taking calls Grace was not present for. She found herself watching him with a different kind of attention now, not clinical, not purely professional, something that scared her more than the men at the gate did. She caught herself noticing the exact way his forearms flexed when he gripped the arms of his wheelchair in frustration, the specific low register his voice dropped into when he was tired and had stopped performing control for the benefit of anyone watching. She caught herself, one evening, standing in the doorway of the study, simply watching him work through papers at his desk, and had to force herself to remember why she was standing there in the first place, which had been to remind him about his evening medication, and had somehow become something else entirely. The confrontation with Bellini's people came on a night Grace had not been prepared for. She had been in the kitchen when she heard raised voices from the front of the house, and had come out to find 2 unfamiliar men in the foyer, and Matteo positioned between them and the staircase that led up toward her room, his wheelchair angled like a barricade, despite what that angling cost him physically. One of the men had a folder in his hand, papers that Grace would later learn contained detailed information about her schedule, her family, her sister's address in Queens. It was, she understood immediately, a threat disguised as a business proposition. Bellini's message was simple: back down from whatever territory dispute Matteo was engaged in, or the nurse becomes part of the negotiation. Grace had not waited to be told to leave the room. She had stepped forward instead, placing herself visibly in the doorway where both men could see her clearly, and had said, calmly, "I know exactly what's in that folder because it's my life, and I'm telling you now that threatening a private nurse to pressure her employer is the kind of thing that draws attention from people who are not supposed to be paying attention." Both men had looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting the target of their message to speak for herself. She had continued, evenly, "If something happens to me, there is a very clear paper trail showing exactly who I worked for and exactly who had motive to want me silenced. I made sure of that the week the car started following me. Consider that before you decide I'm a piece you can move." It had been a bluff, partially. She had, in fact, told her sister everything, given her Matteo's full name and address, made her promise to go to the police if she did not hear from Grace by a specific time each week. It was not nothing. It was enough to make the men in the foyer exchange a look, recalculating. Matteo, beside her, had said nothing during her speech, but she had felt him watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with the danger in the room, and everything to do with something else entirely. The men left without further incident that night, but the message had been sent both ways. Matteo made calls after they left, voice low and final, and within 3 days word came back that the Bellini situation had been resolved, through channels Grace was not told about and did not ask to know. The flowers, she later learned, had been the last overture Bellini would ever make, though nobody explained to her precisely what that meant, and she found she did not want it explained. It should have been over then. The danger passed, the threat resolved, Grace's job theoretically returning to the simple management of medication and physical therapy it had started as. Instead, something had shifted permanently between them, cracked open by the danger and unable to close back up. Matteo began speaking to her at length in the evenings about things that had nothing to do with business. His childhood summers in a small town outside Palermo he had only visited twice. His father's insistence that he learn to play piano despite having no talent for it. Small human details he had clearly not shared with anyone in years. Grace found herself telling him things in return, about her father's hands always smelling like motor oil, no matter how many times he washed them, about the ache of watching her mother clean other women's houses and coming home too tired to eat some nights. One evening, 3 weeks after the Bellini situation resolved, Grace was adjusting the brace on his leg during his evening routine when he caught her wrist, not roughly, just enough to stop her hand and make her look at him. "Grace," he said, in that voice he used only for her name, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand. It is not an apology, because I don't know how to apologize for what I am, but I need you to know that what I felt watching those men look at you in my foyer was not the fear of losing an employee." She had gone very still, aware of exactly how close his hand was to hers, aware of the particular warmth radiating from where his fingers wrapped her wrist. "I know," she had said quietly. "I know it wasn't that." He had looked at her a long moment, some visible war happening behind his eyes between the man who did not explain himself and the man who, apparently, wanted very badly to be understood by her specifically. "This life will never be safe," he had said. "Anyone close to me inherits the danger along with whatever else I have to offer, and I have watched what that danger does to people. I have no right to ask you to accept that." She had said, "You're not asking. I'm choosing. That's different." He had not kissed her that night. He had simply held her hand a moment longer than necessary, and something unspoken had settled into place between them that felt more binding than any declaration could have. Which was why the incident 3 days later cut so deeply. It began with a phone call Grace was not meant to overhear. Matteo's voice from the study rising in a way she had rarely heard, sharp and furious, though the words themselves were indistinct through the door. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She had been passing with his evening medication when the tone stopped her cold. When she finally entered after the call ended, she found him staring at the chessboard again, jaw tight, hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair hard enough to whiten his knuckles. She had asked, carefully, what happened. He had not answered at first, and when he did, his voice had none of the softness from 3 nights before. It had the flat, dangerous quality she remembered from her very first day in this house. "It's not your concern," he had said. She had pushed, gently, saying that anything happening in this house was her concern now, given everything they had just navigated together. He had looked up at her then with something that was not quite anger, but was close enough to frighten her. "You think because I told you what I felt that you're entitled to every part of my business now?" he had said, voice rising. "That's not how this works, Grace. There are things you will never be told, not because I don't trust you, but because knowing them would put you in more danger than you already are, and I will not have that on my hands too." "Too," he had said. The word had landed heavier than he probably intended. "I'm not asking to run your business, Matteo," she had said, matching his rising tone despite herself. "I'm asking you not to shut me out the moment things get difficult, because that's exactly what you're doing right now." He had struck the mahogany side table then, hard, the crack of wood splitting audible even over the pounding of Grace's own pulse. "I have buried my father and my brother because of this life," he had said, voice low again, but shaking with a restrained violence that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with grief he had never fully processed. "I will not add you to that number by pretending you can carry the weight of things you were never meant to carry. This is not a partnership, Grace. This is not equal. You work for me. Remember that." The words had landed like a slap, precisely because they contradicted everything he had said 3 nights earlier, with her wrist in his hand. She had stood there a long moment, absorbing the whiplash of it, watching him breathing hard, watching the shame already creeping into his expression, even as the anger still controlled his voice. She had not screamed back at him. She had simply said, very quietly, "Then, I suppose I know exactly where I stand," and had turned and left the room before he could see what the words had done to her face. She had gone upstairs and begun packing before she had fully decided to leave, her hands moving with the same steady precision they used for administering medication, methodical and calm on the surface, something entirely different underneath. She told herself it was the sensible response. A man who could shift from tenderness to that kind of cold cruelty within the space of 3 days was not a man she should be building any part of her future around, regardless of how her chest had ached listening to him talk about Palermo summers and his father's piano lessons. She had survived worse men than Matteo Russo by knowing exactly when to walk away, and every instinct she had cultivated in 3 months of managing a dangerous household was telling her this was that moment. She was zipping the suitcase closed when she heard the wheels of his chair stop outside her door. She did not turn around immediately. She heard him there, heard the particular quality of his silence, and understood he was working out what to say the way he worked out everything else, carefully, without wasted words. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of the fury from 20 minutes earlier. It had something rawer instead. "Grace," he said, "don't do this because of what I said." She turned to face him then, suitcase in hand, and found him in the doorway, looking smaller in the wheelchair than she had ever seen him look. Not because of his legs, but because of something in his face that had none of its usual armor. "I'm not leaving because of what you said," she told him, which was not entirely true, and they both knew it. "I'm leaving because of what it showed me. You can be a different man in the space of an hour, Matteo, and I have spent my whole life around people who thought that was acceptable as long as they apologized eventually. I decided a long time ago I wasn't going to build anything with someone like that again." "I am not those people," he said, and there was something almost desperate in how quickly he said it. "You put your fist through a table 20 minutes ago," she said. "You told me to remember my place, like I was staff you could dismiss whenever I got too close to something real. That's not nothing, Matteo. I can't unhear that." "I know," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something significant. A man unused to conceding ground of any kind. "I know it's not nothing. I have spent my whole life watching my father control every room he was in, and the one time in years I lost that control, it was because the thought of you being in danger again undid something in me I didn't know was still capable of coming undone. That's not an excuse. I'm not asking you to accept it as one. I'm asking you to understand what it actually was, because it wasn't about you being staff. It was the opposite of that, and I handled it in the worst possible way a person could handle it." Grace stood very still, suitcase handle cutting into her palm, watching him fight visibly for the words that did not come naturally to him. "That's the first time you've explained yourself to me instead of just stating something and expecting me to accept it," she said finally, quietly. "I know," he said. "I told you once I don't apologize easily. When I do, it changes the room. I meant that. This is me changing the room, Grace, and I don't know how to do it gracefully because nobody has ever required it of me before you." She should have kept packing. Every practical instinct she owned told her to finish zipping the bag, walk past him, and drive to her sister's apartment in Queens, where nobody had ever put a fist through furniture in front of her. But something in the rawness of his face, the specific effort visible in every word he was forcing himself to say, made her set the suitcase down on the bed instead. "If you ever do that again," she said, "if you ever shut me out and then punish me for asking to be let in, I will leave. And I won't be standing in this doorway listening to you explain yourself. I will already be gone." "I understand," he said, "I don't think you do yet," she said, "but I think you're capable of learning it, which is more than I can say for most people I've known." He had looked at her for a long moment then, something shifting fully into place behind his eyes, and had said, very quietly, "I made a decision 3 nights ago that I haven't told you about, and I think now is the time to tell you, because I don't want you unpacking that bag under any illusion about what this is between us." She had waited, wary but no longer moving toward the door. "I decided," he said, "that whatever this life costs me, whatever danger it carries, I am not interested in surviving it without you beside me for the rest of however long I have." That is not a proposal delivered well, and I know it. I am not a man who does anything well the first time he tries it emotionally. But I need you to know that what happened tonight was fear talking, not truth. The truth is, I have already decided you are not staff, and you were never staff, from the moment you told those men in my foyer that you had made sure your death would draw consequences. I have never in my life watched anyone stand in a room with men like that and not flinch. I decided that night I was not letting you walk away from this house, not out of possession, but because I don't know how to be the man my father raised me to be without you standing somewhere in the room. Grace felt something in her chest crack open, despite every defense she had built in the last 20 minutes. "That's a strange way to propose marriage, Matteo," she said, and watched surprise flicker across his face that she had named the shape of what he was actually saying before he had said it outright. "It's the only way I know how to say it honestly," he said. "I am asking you to stay, not as an employee, and not as someone I protect out of guilt, but as the person I intend to build whatever is left of my life around, danger included, table-breaking tempers included, though I intend to work on that particular failure specifically. I am asking you to marry me, Grace, knowing exactly what that means, knowing what it costs, knowing you would be walking into all of it with your eyes fully open the way you have walked into everything else since the day you arrived." She did not answer him immediately. She crossed the room instead, closing the distance between them, and knelt beside his chair so they were at eye level, the way she had done 100 times before to change a bandage or adjust a brace, except this time her hands found his face instead of his leg. "I need you to understand something too," she said. "I am not staying because you're dangerous and I find that thrilling. And I'm not staying because I feel sorry for the chair. I'm staying because in 3 months I have watched you carry more weight than any person should have to carry alone. And some reckless, stubborn part of me has decided I want to help carry it, even the parts that terrify me. But if you ever raise your voice like that again and expect me to simply absorb it, this ends. I need you to say you understand that, clearly. Not as an apology, but as a promise." "I understand," he said, and this time the words carried a different weight than they had minutes before. "I promise." She had married Matteo Russo 8 months later in a ceremony far smaller and quieter than his family's reputation might have suggested, in the garden behind the mansion, with Rosa crying openly by the roses and 2 men at the gate who had grown, over the intervening months, into something closer to family than security. The suitcase Grace had packed that night sat unopened in a closet for years afterward, a strange private artifact of the night she had almost walked away with nothing, unaware that the man watching her from the doorway had already decided, somewhere in the quiet architecture of his own damaged heart, that he was never going to let that happen.